Hi, welcome to my presentation on electronic contracts. The internet has only really been used for business purposes since about the 1990s. Prior to that, there was a lot of electronic data interchange, but never really used in the proper contractual sense. This presentation will look at how the statutory requirements of contracts are met in terms of formality. There's been an increased use of electronic documents, or e-documents as they're known, and issues have arisen where the contract must be in writing or must be signed by the other party. In a practical sense, a lot of electronic documents are simply printed out, and therefore it's therefore assumed that the writing has occurred. In the case of McGurran versus Simpson, a court considered that if an email was printed out, it was in fact in writing. In this case, the defendant produced a printed email, and therefore proof that the contract had been formalised. The second question that then leads on from that sometimes is whether the sender has signed the document. And the way the courts have interpreted that, unless it can be proved otherwise, i.e. that the person hadn't signed it, then it's taken as having been signed just by the sending of an email, which would generally be traced back to the logging into a computer system. The Commonwealth Electronic Transaction Act has been in place since 1999. Its objective was to make the law relating to contracts technologically neutral, i.e. they didn't want to have to keep changing the law every time technology changed. When the Act first came in, a number of practical issues arose, and hence the Electronic Transaction Amendment Act of 2011 came into place on the 24th of June 2011. The Amendment Act demonstrates two strong principles. First, there's functional equivalence, where as far as possible, paper-based commerce and electronic commerce should be treated equally by the law. And secondly, is technology neutrality. The law should not discriminate between different forms of technology. The idea is the Act works broadly by not making electronic transactions invalid for the purposes of Commonwealth laws simply because they are electronic. The original Act was based on the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, Model Law on Electronic Commerce, but the 2011 amendments are designed to bring our laws into line with the United Nations Convention on the Use of Electronic Communications in International Contracts, 2005. The Convention is basically designed to enhance legal certainty and commercial predictability, where electronic communications are used instead of traditional paper-based communications. When looking at electronic commerce, there are four categories to be examined. There's business to business, business to government, business to consumer, and government to consumer. This presentation will only deal with the business to consumer transactions. Businesses are increasingly forging contracts online through the internet. And the challenge for a business sometimes is how do they make that contract enforceable? The first point is, of course, they must prove the existence of a contract in the first place. To do that, the intent of the contract must make clear the following 3 points of the agreement. Each party must detail its obligations, what payments are to be made, and when, and finally, the precise details of the goods or services to be completed before that payment can be made. In terms of how the online contract is formed, it goes back to the traditional 4 major points. There must be an offer, an acceptance, an intention to create legal relations, and finally consideration. The fact that it's online doesn't change any of those 4 major components. The Amendment Act helped provide guidance to differentiate between an offer and an invitation to treat. Acceptance of an offer results in the immediate formation of a contract as long as there is an intention to create legal relations later. In the physical world, the display of goods on a store shelf is an invitation to treat. Similar, in an online environment, advertising of goods, like goods displayed on a shelf, is only an invitation to treat. By specifically ordering the goods, the customer would then be making an offer to purchase them, and then the offer can be accepted. The Amendment Act provides that a proposal to form a contract that is not addressed to one or more specific parties and is generally accessible to parties making use of information systems generally is to be considered as an invitation to treat. This is significant because to the customer at home sitting behind their terminal on the internet, they may believe that by clicking on the I agree button or sending an email to the supplier, they are actually accepting an offer made by the supplier. In actual fact, what they are doing is they, as the consumer, are making an offer in response to the owner's invitation to treat. One of the reasons for this is that because the suppliers are publishing out to the entire globe, it would be unrealistic for them to be held accountable or in contract with potentially an almost unlimited number of potential customers. There are 3 ways a user can enter a contract over the internet. They can exchange emails, they can enter into a click-wrap agreement through a website, or by their conduct. For example, if they download software from a website by their actions, it's implying they're entering into the contract. The click-wrap is probably the most interesting of the three. Basically it's the online version of the old shrink-wrap contract. In a shrink-wrap contract, when you broke open the shrink-wrap around the product, you're basically stating that you then owned the content, they were yours. The equivalent of that is an affirmative action by the user when they click on the I agree, the submit, or the I accept button. One of the disadvantages of the old shrink-wrap agreements was that often a person wouldn't know what the actual terms and conditions were until they'd broken open the shrink-wrap and were able to read them. With an online click-wrap agreement, this disadvantage is overcome, in that the terms and conditions in a click-wrap agreement should be disclosed to a potential customer before the transaction is completed. The terms and conditions of the online contract should always be clear, easy to read, and easy to view. It's recommended in the Act that the website put in steps that prevent a user from proceeding to the next stage of the contract acceptance without actually viewing the terms and conditions. This is done by inserting a next or a next page button which takes the user to the terms and conditions page. The implication of this, however, can be that this may be interpreted as just presenting information to a potential customer without actually demonstrating a clear intention to create legal relations. A solution to that is that the final step includes an I agree or an I accept button. This confirms that the user is in fact intending to create legal relations and they have accepted the terms and conditions. In fact, it's actually recommended that the default position on the website is to not agree. Therefore, it's actually a conscious decision by the user to move the cursor onto the I agree button, and that is a deliberate demonstration by themselves that they're willing to enter into the contract. Another issue that the Act and its amendment helps to overcome and clarify is the issue of where is a contract formed geographically. Whilst the business may be conducted on the internet, i.e. in the ether, ultimately in the event of a contract dispute, it's important to know where the contract was actually formed. The basis of a court exercising its jurisdiction can be either location of a party or where the cause of action actually occurred. For example, a foreign company can be carrying on e-commerce in a place and subject to local jurisdiction, even if it has no physical office in that place. And in relation to a contract dispute, where is the contract formed? Is it where the customer clicks on the button from their home? Or is it where the supplier receives that acknowledgement or that acceptance of the offer? By default, it is the courts look at where the originator or the addressee of the contract is and where it has its place of business. In many cases, this can be difficult because a business can be an international one, multinational, and spread over the entire globe. The Act provides that the place of business is to be determined, or can be determined, by taking into account where the party has indicated its business is located, i.e. where it advertises its location. If a party has not indicated a particular location, and if the business only has one location, that will be assumed to be its place of business. If there are multiple business locations, then the place of business will be the principal place of business, or the one having the closest relationship to the transaction. For example, a multinational may have many arms and many lines of commerce. The courts will look at the one that has the alignment most closely with the contract in dispute. It's important also to note that the location of the information systems that were used as part of the contract negotiations is not a sole indicator of a place of business. And similarly, the place of business cannot be determined solely based on the IP address or the domain name of the party. Both these can have no relation on the actual place of business of the party.